Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Noah Komnick, who is the CEO and founder of Seneca, which partners with private and public entities to design and develop defendable enterprises and communities. Noah is also a retired U.S. Marine officer. He was a career communication and information systems officer, a strategic operational planner, and a communications squadron commander. Just prior to his retirement from the Marine Corps, Noah served as a cyber strategist for the nation's Cyberspace Solarium Commission and U.S. Cyber Command. Currently, Noah is a PhD candidate with Capital Technology University, where his interdisciplinary research focuses on the intersection of cybernetics, complexity science, and sociobiology as applied to organizational design. Noah Komnick, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you, and thank you for the gracious invite to have me.
The conversation that I'd like to have with you today, Noah, is basically a tour of your writing and evolution of your thinking about problem solving and decision making. So we're going to cover topics from what you call reaction control to NeoStrategy to your current PhD work. But before we dive into your work, could we take a step back and ask you a couple of questions? For example, what would you say is a common theme or touch point to your writing and work?
I think the common theme is I was inspired by John Boyd. I read him very early in my career, as your audience might know him already as an Air Force pilot, and probably most famously known for the OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, and act. But what intrigued me about him was something that he's less well known for, his energy maneuverability theory. And he took ideas from thermodynamics and brought those ideas into understanding aerial combat in a better way. And the idea of borrowing ideas from one discipline and using them in a different discipline really excited me. And I think that's the big theme along my intellectual progress, if you will, on researching new ideas. It's not just about learning something new, it's also about how can I apply this to solve real world problems.
It dawns on me that problem solving today has perhaps become more interdisciplinary than in the past. I kind of say that with a little bit of a question mark at the end, because I know that interdisciplinary research is not a new thing. And certainly decades ago, there were people that were pulling in ideas from other disciplines to contribute to the problem space that they are working on. But it just seems like there is creativity and looking to non-traditional inputs into problems is becoming more of a thing these days than perhaps before. Do you think there's anything to that at all, or?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think the idea has been around for a long time. One of maybe the older references that I have from that idea is this author called C.P. Snow, and he spoke about the two cultures. And to over summarize his argument, he was really talking about the differences between the humanities and the sciences, and the fact that there needs to be more of an exchange between those two domains. Later on, another reference point is E.O. Wilson, the famous biologist, evolutionary biologist, and he He's written a number of books. He's probably most famous for his study of ants. But one of his books is called Consilience. And that is also a similar argument, but a more specific argument talking about the need that we do need, or the need that we have to solve some problems, to borrow ideas from other domains.
Yeah, for sure. It's cool that you mentioned E.O. Wilson. One of our previous podcast guests, Dr. Mark Moffat, he spoke about societies and belonging, and he studies ants, and he was actually one of E.O. Wilson's doctoral students. We'll put a link up to that in the show notes. So you mentioned John Boyd of OODA Loop fame, and we've had a couple of other OODA Loop related discussions. Are there any other thinkers that have influenced you? You've mentioned a couple, but any other people come to mind?
A lot. I'd say generically, if you talked about, what's the greatest influence on me, I have to acknowledge friends and family.
Sure.
That seems that I think sometimes we jump to the famous authors and creators that exist out there, and neglect the fact that we are heavily influenced by the kith and kin that we surround ourselves with from a very early age. So my mother and father, my wife, those people have a huge effect on me, and of course my friends. But obviously they're not accessible to your audience. I would say Murray Gell-Mann, the famous physicist, he had a significant impact if you study some of his work. And one of the things that he did very well, in my opinion, is he was a great communicator, much like Richard Feynman. And they were colleagues. They worked together. But both of them were great communicators. So I look for people that understand things better than I do, but are very good at communicating them. And that tends to be hard to find. So you have to search for that.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe we can start wading into some of your writing and thinking. So as we mentioned at the top of the show, you retired from the Marines. You got out of the Marines at about 2018, is that right? Or what was the timeline there?
No, just last year I retired. So I've only been retired for about a year.
I see. Okay. Well, when you were a squadron commander, you were recognized by the Secretary of the Navy. This is back in the 2016 timeframe, I think. And you were given an innovation award for outside the box thinking. And this is your work with what you call reaction control. Could you tell our audience a little bit about this work? And I believe you also implemented it within your command. Is that correct?
That is correct. So reaction control actually started, or the idea began, when I was attending the School of Advanced Warfighting. You could say that it was my master's thesis, if you will. And it was really an attempt to address a problem that you probably remember him, General Charles Krulak. He was the one who talked about the strategic corporal. And you're gonna find a theme of complexity through all of my work. And he was talking about how the most junior Marines, the ones that are at the edge of the fight, can make decisions that have strategic consequences because of how complex the world and interconnected the world has become, and how easy it is to have access to information. So the question then becomes, how do you make a Marine a better decision maker? And if you looked at what was available at the time, at least in my opinion, it seemed like the Department of Defense and the services focused a lot of energy and money and effort at therapeutics when a Marine returns from crisis, and not a lot to prepare them before the crisis, other than the rudimentary training. But if you wanted to squarely focus on mental health and how do you increase mental health, and what is that? And I merged that question with this idea of antifragility from Nassim Taleb. Now, and it's relatively easy to explain if you think about going to the gym. Now, you go to the gym and you work out so that you make your body healthier. Now you go to the gym and work out if you're already injured, right? It's in order to make you more fit, but you're already healthy. And that's an important distinction, because sometimes when I've presented reaction control, or people have gained access to some of the writing, they misrepresented it in saying like, oh, well, you're trying to do, therapy or something. No, this is not therapy. This is not for somebody that has already gone through trauma and is trying to remediate from that trauma. This is a way to improve your mental fitness so that when crisis does occur, you're better equipped to deal with it. And in theory, you will suffer less physical trauma, or less mental trauma. Another way to present it is if you just look at what is combat fitness. And I break combat fitness, or what I call complete combat fitness, into 4 parts. There's the physical fitness aspect that we tend to take for granted, and we do a pretty good job of going after that. And then there's the mental fitness, and it does need to be defined. Mental fitness is the ability to make good decisions that will allow you to survive combat. And in this case, reaction control was developed for the Marine Corps. Then the third aspect is spiritual fitness. And that gets confusing too, because people tend to equate that with religion, where it doesn't need to be about religion. It needs to be about, are you at peace with yourself for what you are willing to die for, what you are willing to sacrifice for? Have you found that inner peace? And there's a number of ways to do that, but it's an important aspect, especially going into crisis situations. What are you willing to give up, and why? What is that purpose? And are you comfortable with that? And then the fourth aspect, and this also doesn't get talked about enough, is the social fitness. Nobody survives in combat or in life without the help of others. And you have to have an ability to work with others and to work with people that are much different than you. So there needs to be a social fitness, and all those together is complete combat fitness. And reaction control focuses primarily on mental fitness. And your audience can take a look at the handbook that you've shared. I'm sure you're going to share on your website.
That's exactly right.
But they should also know that that wasn't created just to hand out. I think that's a little bit dangerous, in the sense that handbook was designed to augment a 90-minute interactive seminar that I gave. And the goal of that is to go through a dialectic with the audience to go from their level of understanding of what is possible with mental health and enhance that, open their eyes to some different ideas. And then the handbook is more of a guide that they can take with them, so that the two complement each other when they talk to other people about what is reaction control. And I guess I should say, this is another theme with all of my work. It's never finished. Even at the end, the last page of the handbook, it says this is about a lifelong process to improve your decision making. And I only summarized a few things within a few pages, just to make it as short and concise as I could. But it's something that I continue to develop to this day and add to it. And I get great challenges from colleagues to make it a better product. But the idea is, you don't have to wait for crisis to happen in order to think about your mental health. You can think about your mental health just like you think about your physical health. And this gives at least one option to go through life and improve your mental health on your own with a self-regulating process.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Noah. And of course, we will have a link to this in the show notes so that the audience can go and check it out if they like. So you developed this reaction control methodology or framework originally so that you could help make your military unit as ready as possible, or at least, have this inform your readiness. So it was developed in a military context, but this methodology is applicable to communities, corporate organizations, and entire societies. Would you say that that's fair?
Yes. And I'm actually very happy you phrased it that way, because it reminded me of a few things. So reaction control, I would say, is a philosophy, not a methodology, not a rigid framework. It's a philosophy, and it's definitely not a therapy. That's not what I'm going after. And the connection with my time as a squadron commander, that was the next time where I was actually leading Marines since I created reaction control. Reaction control was an academic endeavor, an intellectual endeavor in 2013. I took command in 2015, and while I was in command, deploying Marines all across the globe, I thought, well, geez, I have this tool that I created, and I'm not sharing it. I need to share this, and maybe it will help some Marines cope with the stress and rigors of combat and life in general, which is what I think your question is getting to, because life is stressful. If you look at, I don't have the statistics up in front of me right now, so I would definitely defer the audience to go to an authoritative source, but I think some of the statistics on the recent suicides within the DoD, they're not all attributable to service members coming back from combat deployments. They're often attributable to service members having very difficult lives, as all of us have difficult lives, and learning to how to cope with that so that we can maintain our mental acuity is fundamental to surviving in what I call this age of complexity.
Perhaps we can traverse now to some of your follow-on work while you were still on active duty, but you went to the Naval War College, I believe, and you started writing about NeoStrategy. Could you unpack what NeoStrategy is and how it drops into this conversation?
Sure. Just to pick up, the anchor point is John Boyd. So that was when I was a lieutenant, when I was first introduced to him. And if you look into the wide scope of materials that he considered, a lot of it dealt with complexity. So even since then, I've been intrigued with this idea of complexity. And by the time that I went to the Naval War College, that was post-command, I wanted to continue that in a much more deliberate and aggressive manner. And I was very blessed to have been accepted to the Gravely Advanced Research Program. And it was in that program that I had intellectual or academic freedom to really explore what can we learn from complexity science that will help us better understand and better fight the next war. So I'm literally looking for lessons that are in a different domain and saying, well, how can this help us make better sense about the operating environment that we have today? And as I started to do that, one of the very first things I did was just look at strategy itself fundamentally. And one of the two papers, the shorter paper on NeoStrategy, focuses just on that aspect, just the fundamental abstract nature of strategy. And I like to use Colin Gray's description of strategy because the late Colin Gray, unfortunately, but he was a wonderful military theorist and again a great communicator. So you can read his materials and he can really make an impression and bring clarity to an otherwise complex topic. And when he describes strategy, he describes it as this triad of ends, ways, and means. And it's a reconciliation process. He sometimes uses the term strategy bridge. Well, when you just look at that, so this is abstract strategy again. So it applies at all layers, tactical, operational, strategic level. If you assume that you have a goal and you know where you're at and you're trying to get to that goal and you figure out some way to get there, then by default, you assume prediction. And that's the key thing. So if I want to get from point A to point B, and all I have to do is X, Y, and Z, then I've already made a prediction. I've already made a prediction that if I don't do X, Y, and Z, I'm not going to get there. Mm-hmm. And that creates a problem. It creates a problem because that's not always possible. And one of the things that really opened my eyes is the work of Kenneth Stanley and Joel Layman. They might not be readily known, but they wrote a short book called Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned, The Myth of the Objective. And they're computer scientists, and they developed a program to really test this thing out. And I'm not going to try to summarize their whole book, but they basically prove that in many cases, if the goal is very ambitious, and if there's a lot of steps in between where you are right now and where you want to get, then the more ambitious it is, the less likely you're going to be able to develop a plan for it, which is what a strategy is. Strategy is a plan to get somewhere. So why NeoStrategy? Well, NeoStrategy recognizes that strategy doesn't always work. And once again, I go back to Colin Gray. Colin Gray explains that strategy, the art of strategy, is unlimited. It's always been there. It's a byproduct of how humans work with each other, and it's inescapable. And if you look at how the military operates today, we always say, well, develop a strategy to do whatever. Well, sometimes that's not going to work. And so that's the requirement for a unique term, NeoStrategy. Another way to envision this is strategy is a circle, and it's a concentric circle inside NeoStrategy. So NeoStrategy doesn't negate strategy. It just recognizes the fact that in high complex situations, strategy in and of itself won't work. And going back to that book by Stanley and Layman, they actually present the idea of it's better to seek novelty, like how we train robots to walk, seeking novelty, how we learn to walk as small humans. We tend to seek novelty. We don't follow a meticulous plan. We experiment with novelty in order to learn. So I hope that was a clear introduction to what it is.
Yeah, thanks. We have a future guest coming on the show. not to infuse too much of his thinking into your discussion here, but I think it might be useful. This fellow named Josh Kerbel, he's with the National Intelligence University, but one of the things that he says frequently is trying to develop a methodology for anticipatory intelligence. And I think the way he describes it, obviously I can't put words into his mouth, is that we need to be constantly scanning the global ecosystem for faint signals which are emerging from this complex world that we live in. And the touch point with what you were just saying, Noah, is that if we plan a strategy and say, okay, gang, here's what we're going to do, A, B, C, X, Y, Z, ready, let's go do this thing. If that is our way of navigating the world today, it's likely to fail because other things are likely to emerge that we will not have considered while we're making this linear strategy that typifies the way we've been navigating the world basically up to this point, but certainly, during the Cold War. Do you think that there's something that you could tease out of all that?
Yes, a few things. I'll start with the last, your more recent portion before I go back to how you open that up. So NeoStrategy, one of the premises of that is not that strategy will lead you to a less desirable solution, or it might have additional risk along the way. Mm-hmm. I make a more extreme statement. I make the statement that in some situations, strategy will often never get you to where you want to go. It will never work because it is just too ambitious to get there. An easy example from biology is evolution, actually. Look at what's the most complex thing that we operate with every day? Our own human body. Was our human body designed by a strategy? No, it was designed by natural selection over plenty of years, to
Right.
put it simply, right?
Yeah.
So the bolder claim is that strategy will just utterly fail in some situations. That it's better not to have a plan. You can also apply that to innovation. A lot of times we make failed attempts we want to innovate to this specific criteria.
Right. Yeah.
And we focus on that criteria, not realizing that the path to get there is something well beyond our understanding. And that's, again, we just have to look at nature to learn that. Going back to the article that you referenced, I did do a quick scan, quick read of the article. The terminology we have to be precise about, and I think that's what the author was getting at. And I think he hits on a few good points. But you actually mentioned anticipation, and I think you have to be careful with that too, because anticipation assumes that you have enough information and you know all the rules, right? That's the Newtonian, Descartes understanding of how the world works. It's Laplace's demon, if you will, is what the physicists would say. It's what Laplace said. Whoa, hey, if we can figure out all these universal laws and we have the right information, then we can predict the future. And that's what anticipation is. Well, you can anticipate the environment. And NeoStrategy, beyond the first paper just addresses fundamentally the problem with abstract strategy. The next paper introduces the idea of, okay, what are the other things that we can glean from cybernetics and complexity science. And some of those things I talked about at the International Conference on Complex Systems in 2018, much more in detail than what I wrote in my papers. And I'll go over a few of them. War. We often associate a mental model of war as the Clausewitzian duel. And it's a very useful model because thinking about war as a duel reminds the practitioner that there's choice. We commonly say the enemy gets a vote, right? That you're dealing with human choice. It's not just about natural laws colliding against each other. But I think that model is still it is still good, but it's not sufficient for understanding the world today. And war should be better thought of as a clash of systems. And one of the great benefits of that is when you look at irregular war, like the one that we just got out of, and you say, well, with irregular war, you're not looking to completely crush the adversary's system. You're looking to just change it. And that's a whole different problem set, because we're not looking to replace the whole infrastructure. We just want to change it to a more suitable condition. And that's a very, very daunting challenge, because once again, it assumes that you know the intricacies and the complexities of that given system. One of the other things, and then I'll turn it back to you in case I'm taking too long to answer these questions.
No, this is good. It's hard to put these kinds of things into a 90-second or 30-second elevator pitch. So yeah, please proceed.
Right. So one of the other aspects, you mentioned anticipation. One of the other aspects that I talked about at the conference was the idea of survival. And the common intuition is, well, anticipate and innovate, right? Be agile, be adaptable, anticipate, innovate. And I don't think that's going to get us that far. I think we have to move beyond that and think about being anti-fragile. And the great thing about anti-fragile, again, this is Taleb's idea, is it refocuses your time on your own system. So we get we've often heard the idea that intelligence drives operations. Well, once again, this is making a big assumption. One, it's making the assumption that you have sufficient information and you know all the rules that are at play. But that's not the case. So we spend a lot of time trying to anticipate or understand the environment or understand the belligerent that we are facing. And we spend very little time examining ourselves. But if we looked at ourselves as a system that we have to sustain in perpetuity, where we never culminate, then that should really be the driver of our future actions. Because the idea of chasing after more and more information and more intelligence is once again falling victim to Laplace's demon. And we can prove it a number of ways, but that's where you pull from the ideas of complexity science to really get a handle on how almost impossible that becomes as the complexity of the environment that you're working in increases.
Right. So the article that Noah mentioned just a moment ago to our audience is called National Security Language is Stuck in the Cold War by Josh Kerbel. And we'll have a link to that in the show notes. And we'll be interested to hear Josh's perspective on all of this as well. But, back to the OODA loop and John Boyd, it seems like that is a useful way of thinking about navigating strategically. Don't you think that there could be a methodology where we, and by we I mean mankind, but possibly the United States as well, we are somehow monitoring the global ecosystem continually, and it's imperfect, right? You were just saying yourself, it's not like we can collect intelligence on everything and have a perfect picture. Far from it. But if you think about the globe and all of the ecosystems that make up our world, those are cybernetic systems that are interacting with one another, feeding off one another. But you can go from today, and the Earth or the global ecosystems process whatever information hits the inbox today. It gets processed. It spits out something which is emergent. Maybe it's like a marginal change from yesterday, but all of this can be monitored in an OODA loop type of a fashion. And then whatever gets output tomorrow, then gets decided upon and continues to inform strategy. Do you think that kind of an outlook is potentially useful, or do you think that that is playing a fool's game to try to put together something like that?
So it's a very good question, because it brings us back to a central point here. The OODA loop does work. It is a great mental model. But when we learn mental models, what's the famous saying by George Box? All models are wrong.
Oh yeah,
some are useful, because you always abstract away information, right? Mm-hmm. It's a heuristic, and they are useful. The key question to ask is, when you learn these things, is to ask, well, it works, but when does it not work? And I would say the OODA loop fails depending on your scale of observation and orientation. So if you think of scales, and we don't have to think in military context. You can think of industry context. You can think of the labor layer. The workforce that actually provides the service or builds the product, your labor. And then you have the management labor. And then you have maybe the vice president layer, and then you have the C-suite. So those are all different scales. And if you are at one of those layers, then it becomes very hard for you to use the OODA loop, if that's your chosen decision mechanism, to understand and make decisions at a layer below you or above you, because you have emergence. And we should probably define that here in a little bit, but you have emergence that goes from the lower layer to the higher, and it's bidirectional. It's working both ways, right? So if you're a manager, you probably can't understand the local complexities that the labor is experiencing, and you probably can't understand the local complexities that the C-suite is dealing with. So yes, the OODA loop sounds great and it does work, but we have to realize, well, when does it not work? And scale matters, because if you think you can apply that indiscriminately, it will get you into trouble, because it assumes you're going to have enough observation and you have the requisite orientation, i.e. the mental models, in order to make sense of those observations.
You started talking about organizations and management just a moment ago, and I think that this might be a good time to segue into some of your PhD research. Could you unpack what you're working on right now, please, for our audience?
Sure, absolutely. It's like some of the other stuff that we've talked about. It's another quest for me to look at other domains and attempt to derive some lessons. I think the PhD research itself is quite a bit more ambitious because of the amount of information that I'm trying to understand myself and make sense of, and then articulate it for an audience. And the idea really generated during my last job while a U.S. Marine, and that was as a cyber strategist for U.S. Cyber Command, and then as the command's representative on the Cyberspace Solarium Commission as a cyber strategist for that national commission that looked at national security in the eyes of cyberspace. And one of the epiphanies that I had was that we tend to view cyberspace heavily with an understanding from computer science. And the problem with computer science is it often neglects the human, and which is, let me include your podcast here. You talk about the crucible, right? Or the cognitive crucible, right? The cognitive dimension, because these are just machines. But the real important thing is the human in it. And that's what got me really interested again in cybernetics. And as I left the service, I thought, well, cyberspace offers plenty of problems and plenty of people are looking at that. What's another problem that not enough people are looking at? And I think it's how we organize ourselves as human beings. And this goes at all scales, from small teams to human civilization. Is there something that we can learn from a transdisciplinary or an interdisciplinary effort to come up with new questions to ask ourselves when we decide to create an organization to do whatever? Maybe it's a new product or a new service, and we often start with describing in detail, what is that product? What is that service? And then we reduce it. Here's that problem of reductionism that comes up again. You reduce it into its components, and now I know how many people to assign to each component in order to provide this service or assemble this product. And it's a process of addition, when what's really going on, when we put these people together, is a process of multiplication. And that's what leads to emergence, because emergence, another way to say emergence, is irreducibility, because we have phenomenon that is only manifested through the interaction of all these people working together. And that's something that's very difficult to control, because you can't reduce it. It's irreducible. But that's the other side of the coin, if you will, about emergence. So if that's the case, if reductionism doesn't get us to a good enough organizational construct, then what is the right question to ask? And I'm far enough along in the research to say that I think I know what a good question is. And we need to start looking at not only, I'm not saying that reductionism is not useful. It is still useful, but on its own, it is dangerous. We need to also start looking at internal and external complexities of the organization. The external complexities are what we want to, the work that we want to do on the environment. The internal complexities are the things that coalesce the organization. If you had no internal complexities, there would be no organization. There has to be a connecting mechanism, if you will. And the relationship between those two things, the dynamics between those two things, should better inform us on how and at what scale do we grow organizations. Because I think a lot of times we're creating organizations, and when we fall into the old, what I call the masters of yesterday, if you wanted to summarize the masters of yesterday, they're optimization, economies of scale, just-in-time efficiency. Great ideas, all came from Taylorism, scientific management, really, if you want to go back to its core, but they don't work as well in a high complex environment. They're starting to fail us. And there's numerous examples to prove that. So what are the new masters? That's the optimum question. What are the new masters? And I think it's signals, boundaries, and transitions. Signals and boundaries, I stole that from John Holland, another Santa Fe Institute professor. And I added the term transitions because in my own experience, especially as a U.S. Marine, you learn that transitions tend to be your highest risk evolutions, right? Transitions from one phase to the next phase. And so it's, and just to think of signals and boundaries, and I think John Holland actually has a book named Signals and Boundaries, and he's another great communicator too for your audience. But boundaries, they're not static. They're going to change over time, and we do have to transition through them. But too often we fall into a trap of like, let's optimize a process, let's optimize an organization. Well, that causes tightly coupled organizations that when they run into some unknown stress or unanticipated stress, they fracture. Or worse, over time, they devolve. And I think that's what we're going to start to see in society. We've already started to see it, where the complexity of the world is challenging our institutions, and the authority that those institutions once had is starting to devolve to the local layer. Local autonomy is going to have more of an impact on how society evolves than from these institutions.
Yeah, that's thought-provoking stuff there, Noah, for sure. A previous guest on the Cognitive Crucible, I know you know Yanir Baryam of the New England Complex Systems Institute. He came on and gave his perspective on the problems we face. And we mentioned this briefly at the very end of the discussion with Yanir, but I'd be curious to get your take on this and whether your PhD work is aligned with this kind of a project that Yanir is working on. But he calls it he has a short piece called The Team's Manifesto. And I'm not going to do it justice, but I think Yanir has in mind, some kind of a global apparatus to, harness the power of teams in some kind of a emergent fashion where people are assembled into teams dynamically for purposes that are also emergent. Do you think your PhD work and what I was clumsily describing with Yanir's teaming project, is there any kind of a touch point there?
Absolutely. In fact, I reference his work with regards to teams. And I suspect, although I haven't listened to the podcast, I suspect he probably mentioned Ashbys Law of requisite variety, which is it's just a cybernetic law from Ross Ashby, and it's an extremely powerful understanding, and it's simple to understand relatively, and I'll briefly explain it. It really comes from this metaphorical understanding of what a thermostat does, right? And the idea is that the thermostat can only have a degree of control over the environment relative to its variety. He used the term variety, Ashby did, relative to its variety in comparison to the environment, right? So if you wanted to have perfect control over the environment, you have to match the variety or exceed the variety. And I think that's one of the key arguments or supporting structures of Yanir's work with regards to teams, and the fact that individuals leading organizations will begin to fail because you run into the problem of cognitive complexity. An individual can only handle understanding so much complexity. But how do we recruit people right now? How do we hire individuals into our organizations? We look at the individual. Very seldom do we hire teams. And that's what he is really making the leap towards. And my work is actually an extension off of his, because I accept what he says. And I say, well, how do you do that then? Then how do you design that team? And that team can be a large team or a small team. And with regards to, because you mentioned about the global kind of perspective, I have heard him talk about that. I think it's important here to mention the idea of risk. If you're at a very high level of an organization, so you're large scale, then you should be focused on systemic risk. But too often we get dragged down into something called idiosyncratic risk, right? So when you look at an organization, the question that should be foremost on your mind is, how do you sustain this organization and avoid systemic risk? Taleb talks about tail risk, right? And too often we get sucked in by our own passions into looking at idiosyncratic risk because we want to make everything perfect, and that's good, and that's fruitful. But if doing that causes you to ignore the systemic risk that you are taking on, then it could be catastrophic. And that's another aspect that I think Yanir would probably agree with, that you have to think about risk at different scales. And if you're at a very high scale, don't encumber yourself with trying to make sense of the risk at very low scales, because you're just not going to be able to understand it. You cannot understand the local complexity. You're too far removed, and you lack the faculties for understanding that risk.
All right. Well, Noah, you've given us a lot to think about, and we will have as many links to the various different references you cite and the papers that you've written as we can in the show notes for our audience to go and check out. And with that, Noah Komnick, thank you so much for being on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you for having me.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.